Cheryl Henson, the president of the Jim Henson Foundation. Lisa Henson, the CEO of
the Jim Henson Company.
Director of tonight's film, a USC alum, and an honorary doctorate holder from USC. Ron Howard. Documentary films, like any film, are a special kind of journey, but there's something unique in the journey that the filmmaker and the subjects of a film, as well as those who are custodians of the subject of the film, go through. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the beginning and end of that journey for each of you. Ron, this subject, Jim Henson, provided you with an embarrassment of riches that any documentary filmmaker would just love to sink their teeth into, including an archive the likes of which is a dream. I'm wondering, aside from the objective part of it, at the beginning of this, was there something personal that connected you to Jim and his work that made you feel especially excited to get started more?
Well, at first, when the possibility came my way, I had no personal connection with Jim. I met him once, very, very briefly, longtime admirer like everyone, you know. And I'd also known that, you know, that people had thought about trying to make a scripted version of his life and things like that. So I knew that it was sort of out there in the ether that, you know, this was a life, you know, really worthy of examining. I didn't know very much more than that. But when Justin Wilkes from Imagine and Sarah Bernstein, who runs the documentary group, said there might be an opportunity here. Would you like to look at the archives and have a conversation with the family? There's been some reluctance over the years to actually, you know, have a documentary focusing, a new one, sort of comprehensive. Would you want to explore it? And of course, the immediate answer was absolutely, but I had no sense of sort of where beyond celebrating Jim and the work, you know, was there going to be an interesting story and something to reveal? And that came in conversation, and then watching the archive together and continuing to talk, because I felt like I didn't know, and I related to this, the kind of the ups and downs of the creative journey, and I also didn't understand the family story, which I thought was very interesting and relatable and significant in this case, because, you know, so he's remembered as a sort of a family-friendly artist, yet he was so much more complicated than that. And the family lived a very unique kind of experience in and around all of these characters. There were some complications and so forth, and yet I could also see that what existed was this tight-knit group that really loved their mom, loved their dad, loved their family, and what it stood for. And I thought, well, that was just very interesting and honest. And so I suddenly began to believe that, hey, of course, and then you see this archival stuff, and there's so much that I didn't know about, including disappointments, you know, creative, you know, outcomes that weren't at the time very gratifying. So I began to see it as that it could be a kind of a ride, and that there was a narrative there that we could relate to, that could be a little surprising, and yet leave plenty of room for us to celebrate, you know, all that we already know we love about him, but be reminded of all that. But it really was the convincer for me was the conversation, and then the cooperation too, to make so much of that available to us.
This provides me a natural chance to ask about that conversation and about your role as sisters and as the daughters of Jim. You take a leap when you make a documentary film, and in it in some way or another. And it's a leap born of trust, fundamentally, but usually I find in my experience making these sorts of films, there's some extra dimension of understanding. Sometimes it's inchoate, sometimes it's explicit. What gave you the confidence? Where did you find a sort of personal sense of this was the right time and Ron was the right person to do this?
We were really hoping that there would be a match, like a magical match made between my father and the filmmaker. And so we did, we just kept pushing off all kinds of people coming to us about making the documentary, and so many people said, well, this was the most important thing for them, and it would change their lives to get to make the documentary. So it was kind of heartbreaking, but we kept saying no. And we said, we need this to be made by like a great director, and it should be somebody who is like a spiritual, creative match. And so maybe Ron didn't know that Jim was for him, but we knew Ron was for Jim.
Cheryl, did you have some sense
Lisa
of
was
it?
really spearheading this project,
Uh-huh.
and she's the one who's really deeply involved in the film industry, and was talking to the different documentary filmmakers, and has such enormous respect for Ron's work. I'll say from our side back in New York, I work with the company Archivist, and so I want to say that our archivist, Karen Falk, was hired by my mother not long after my father's passing. And the only archive work that was done before that was by Bobby Payne, who in a very, very early photo that Ron shows, Bobby was puppeteering on Sam and Friends with my mom when my father went to Europe. So his relationship with the company goes back that far. So my mom had him gathering materials, and my father was really incredibly thorough about saving all kinds of stuff, from ticket stubs to individual films that he had seen, programs from films that he liked, from stage productions that he liked. There's so much material there, but it was really Karen Falk who over 32 years pulled it all together. And it was from her work that we were able to work with a couple of museums. So we have a permanent exhibit at the Museum of Moving Image and a permanent exhibit at the Center for Puppetry Arts. And she's also worked with the Smithsonian and with MOPOP. And so having that expertise and that depth of material, I think really made us excited about the possibility of one day having a documentary.
The other thing that I would just say is that in watching the films, going like the Sam and Friends stuff and those commercials, I didn't know anything about that. Although I didn't remember having seen a few of these things as a kid. But the other thing was that I began to feel like there was if we could find the way to sort of co-opt and channel Jim's aesthetic a little bit within the framework of the movie. That would just be fun. It would be fresh. It would be exciting, and it was very infectious. And we loved that. And as the various animations that we created, for some of the transitions and so forth started coming in, it was great to see this idea of mine that I kept pushing for really sort of add up. And even shooting Frank Oz the first day, which was one of our first big interviews. I just kept thinking, well, what would Jim have done? What would Frank do? When they were doing this, they'd want to kind of not take it too seriously. So we thought of the idea of stop motion as Frank sort of entered the set and the chair came swirling around, and it was just fun to sort of to try to, as I said, co-opt it and run with it. And I think on the music side, Dave Fleming, and on the editorial side, Paul and Sierra, we all just embraced that, and it was made it just a lot of fun from a filmmaking standpoint.
Well, it gets transmitted absolutely to the viewer, to us, and that feeling of discovery. It's like, oh, I didn't know about that. I mean, that really, it's part of the thrill of seeing the film, as is the playfulness that you're channeling as well. One of the things that Cheryl was talking about is this, ticket stubs, and I'm sure in the course of making this, there were discoveries that you came upon, you know, beyond the things you just mentioned, that you said, whoa, I didn't know
Oh,
that.
yeah.
I'm curious, for the two of you, brothers and sisters, that's good of hearing this, you must have, I mean, I'm guessing there's something in the process of making this film that helped you see your dad in a new way, or you just plain out didn't know, so I'm curious.
I'll just say that we did open up our archives for the whole Imagine team, but the best surprise for me was the first time that we saw the movie, and it opened with footage I had never seen. And, you know, we were just blown away that the footage that belonged to the photographer,
Oh, that interview.
we had never seen that. And by the way, he evidently has hundreds of hours of incredible interviews, just like that. And there were, and then the Orson Welles, which I hadn't really, maybe I knew of it, but hadn't focused on it. And so we had many surprises, and it was wonderful that, you know, the team went out and solicited footage from all over the place and didn't use just our archive. So it was an eye-opener for us.
Yeah, stylistically, that interview being conducted by a still photographer is just magic, because he's not thinking he's being interviewed. He's thinking his picture being taken, and it's sort of candid and a little helter-skeltery and really refreshing.
One surprising challenge in all of this was that neither Jim, and particularly Jane, really liked being interviewed. And so we wanted to put as much of this into their voices as, you know, as possible, and let them narrate, their own film as much as we could. And yet, you know, it's not something that they coveted very much. And so that was pretty good. And I think he was a little bit surprised in the way that this photographer was talking to him, and he wasn't really thinking about being on TV and being interviewed. And Jane was really, you know, she just wasn't particularly into all of that. You know, digital technology kind of saved us at the last minute. We were really struggling to get enough of her in the movie, because that was one of the surprises to me, and I really wanted people to understand how much she had contributed to the launching of the Muppets and their world and that aesthetic and sensibility that we've all gained so much appreciation for. But late in the game, we sort of found these tapes where she, either for an article or maybe she was thinking about a chapter in a book or something, and she'd sort of done kind of an interview, but it was really just a thing where, you know, it had been a cassette tape on a table, you know, 6 feet from her or something, pretty garbled. And digital technology helped us tune it.
You were able to
clean it up enough that we could really use it.
Yeah, her voice, literally, but also her presence in the film, and the sort of the tension in their marriage, and the tension, you know, in her life, especially, you know, as a woman being a parent at the sort of onslaught of the women's movement in the early 70s, gives this a kind of depth and poignance to the consequences of kind of creative passion, the blindness that it can sometimes occupy.
Well, it's the relatability. Again, it's great to celebrate people and what they accomplish, but there are always factors. There are pressures. There's a price to be paid. You know, I mean, no journey is simple and clean. And, you know, and it's you know, it was important to me, and at the same time, I felt like it could be dealt with honestly as the family deals with it and talks about it, you know, in an honest way that still it didn't detract from what was accomplished. You know, it was you could sort of say, yeah, life's complicated, not, you know, it's not always smooth sailing. And yet, look what they created. Not only all, you know, not only all this amazing work, not only did it lead to the stuff that Jim and his other collaborators could build upon, but a great family, you know, and of really intelligent, caring, you know, loving siblings.
Thank you.
I think the film does celebrate that, and it is it's a remarkable thing, and I thought a lot about your dad and his childhood, and how the life that he launched was kind of a reaction to it. In certain ways, there's not a whole lot of information about his youth, but what a remarkable thing that so many of his kids have embraced the life that he and your mom created, as opposed to giving you something to push back against. Was that something you were hoping the film would deliver to audiences, or was that something that kind of surprised you when you saw the film, that it celebrated your family in that way?
Such a nice idea that it celebrates our family that way. I guess I didn't really think of it that way. I feel like it's really a film about Dad and Mom and Dad and Frank, but it's wonderful that we're all included, so that's a good thing.
I didn't think we would be in it so much. Ron did suffer a little bit from the lack of footage of Jim talking about himself, and as you said, my mom talking about herself. And I didn't initially think that there would be so many interviews, so we didn't expect to be the subjects. But it was interesting. I mean, we all really learned from my dad, and I think he was all of our mentor. And for me, I felt as a kid he was my best friend and my mentor. I know you're very close to your dad too, so we were all so close to him that I'm proud to have been involved with it, but that wasn't really our goal.
Well, no, I mean, I'm guessing this was kind of a discovery, an unexpected product of the film. There's a beautiful little section of the film where your brother talks about getting to work with him and discovering this other side of him, the playful side. Like, well, when he's at home, he's got to be a dad, but when he's at work. And it sounds as though you each in a different way had a taste of that too. Or?
Yes, I think the three of us worked, that Brian, Lisa, and I had the most opportunity to work with my dad, and I traveled with him a great deal, and so that's, I think, the way that I was able to spend time with him.
Yeah, she famously got stuck at an airport cooking up the plot for Dark Crystal, right? They got snowed in at an airport. So she got to be part of the famous traveling brainstorming.
And Lisa's famously involved with scripts when you were still in high school, right?
Forever.
Lisa was always giving script notes.
Yeah, my father loved to work when he was traveling, and he would look forward to that quiet time on the plane, and he would get like a fresh yellow pad out and new pens, and so yes, if you traveled with him, you would just be in a very intimate relationship with somebody who is actively creating, like 2 feet from you. It was really fun.
And enjoyed communicating about it. Yeah. So it wasn't just that he was in his own little bubble making it. He liked to talk about ideas and stuff. And Lisa and I do like to tell the story of that. Lisa and I, the early Muppet Show, I think first season, were building puppets in the workshop because, as Heather said very often, we were there because that's where we were. I mean, and so as long as you're there, you start building puppets, or you start puppeteering, and so we were building lobsters for the Swedish chef to cook, and she built the lady lobster, the perfect lady lobster, and I built the 3 lobster banditos that come in and save her. So, but that kind of having the opportunity to do that when you're still in high school is really fun. Really good time.
Creativity becomes a familiar act. It's something that's part of it.
It's one thing that was interesting and I think relatable to a lot of us here tonight is just the energy around just making stuff.
Well, this must be familiar to you, Ron.
Well, yeah. I mean, and making things to be shared, but you also are enjoying that process and the ongoing experimentation. And yes, he was good enough and connected with the audience well enough that he was commercially successful, but he was first and foremost artistically ambitious and creative and having fun with that. And I think the family learned, and they lived in it constantly, and Jane had it as well. But I think there's a real lesson for us when you think about that Sam and Friends stuff and those commercials. TV was new; it was the latest medium, and they were just finding their way by doing it. They just found an inroad and did it. And it's a lot like people who start experimenting on TikTok or something, and they come up with something. And it was their way of kind of fighting their way into the world,
Yeah.
and discovering what they could offer audiences, and then responding to that. And then he kept pushing those boundaries. The other thing that really influenced the movie and influenced me was timepiece. And as I think one of you say, I forgot who says it in the in the movie, in the interview. If you want to know about our dad, just look at Timepiece. But there's that energy and drive, and also the sort of the push and pull of all the different kinds of feelings that human beings have, and that is so present in that film, and it's very autobiographical. It really is about that energy, about life and about creativity. I thought he was so inspiring.
It's interesting to say that you found it inspiring, given the incredible body of work and variety of work you've done yourself. I wanted to ask you about your pivot into documentary filmmaking, because it wasn't that long ago.
No, it wasn't.
It was the Beatles, right? Was that the first
I did one right before that, a couple of years before that, maybe a year before. Brian Grazer at Imagine we both love documentaries, but he first experimented with it, and it, unfortunately, the companies that we were then under contract to, that Imagine was under contract to, wanted us doing movies and TV, and didn't like that we were doing documentaries, or that Brian was getting into that, and they were very angry about this. But he was determined.
Good for him.
We did one about wrestling. We did one called Inside Deep Throat. They were fascinating to work on, and because of that, and a connection going back to American Gangster, when Jay-Z was getting ready to curate a music festival called Made in America in Philadelphia, his producer, partner on that, this guy named Steve Stout, asked Brian if he thought I'd be interested in shooting the behind the scenes. And then we didn't really know what it was going to be, but they had some money set aside for this. And so I was asked about it. Brian said, "Is this something you'd want to do?" And it was just a couple of weeks out, 3 weeks out. And I was in the middle of post-production on Rush, but I was in kind of a little window. It was happening on a weekend where I was going to be home alone anyway. Cheryl was going to be with the kid. And Brian knew I had long been interested in trying the documentary medium, but I was intimidated by it. And he asked me about this. He said, "Would you want to do this?" So I thought, I don't know. I'm on the board of this organization called the Jacob Burns Film Center in Westchester County.
I know well, yeah.
And Jonathan Demme the late great Jonathan Demme was a board member. So after this board meeting, I went to Jonathan, who was of course a great documentarian as well as being an Academy Award-winning, narrative director. And I said, what do you think about this? And of course, Jonathan was just such a cheerleader. He said that his words were so wise, and they continue to resonate with me. He said, "Go for it." He said, first of all, don't be intimidated. You're going to wind up using more muscles that you already have than you realize, because a lot of it is a post-production process, and that post is post, and it's finding the story and refining it. And he said, but here's the one thing that's different. He said, you got to go into the plan, but you have to be ready to be wrong. You have to recognize it and see where the story is taking you. But that's the good news. That's the excitement. And I've just found that to be the case. And I've found that even with this behind the scenes doc, I was able to put more of myself into it than I even realized, make discoveries, and I found it just very creatively energizing. Then the Beatles documentary came to me because producers, they liked that, and it was related to music, and I sort of had to interview, with Paul and Ringo and the rest of the family for that. But I found that very satisfying, and I'm just feeling that my scripted work is sort of improving or evolving in a way because of the time that I'm putting in on the documentary side as well. I think the two are sort of feeding off of each other in interesting ways, and it really satisfies my curiosity, and it's and I meet great people, and the people who are full time in the doc world are a fascinating group of people, and they're a little different than the people who are full time here. And it's just a dedicated group of sort of intellectually determined and curious people, and I enjoy spending time with them.
We're here. One of my favorite marks about documentary filmmaking was from a Czech director named Karel Weiss, who did a beautiful film, Sweet Dreams, and he said, verite documentary filmmaking is not about getting what you want, it's about wanting what you get. And that's that,
Yeah.
Have a plan and then be ready.
Well, one of the things that I like about it, just to get, is the and one of the reasons why I like its impact on my scripted work is that you unless someone does say it in a documentary, if there's an idea that you discover, you might, and no one is literally saying it, or you don't have the archival footage, or you, in your verite world, you didn't quite get the moment. But it's truthful, it's honest. You want to get this idea out there. You have to find ways to convey it and build it, and it's an interesting challenge. But often it lands in a little deeper way, a little more significant, surprising way. And so I look for those opportunities in scripted now to sort of convey something in a slightly more surprising way, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I feel that watching this film often, that there's a creative solution that's liberating and that's free and kind of surprising, like the idea of the cube that then becomes the setting for the interviews. When you sat for your interviews, were you aware that you were in this cube space that was going to be? So you knew that was going on.
Yeah, you couldn't really miss it.
Well,
but it was just this gray thing. We didn't really know how. I kept saying, I bet we can use images on the walls, but we didn't exactly know.
It was just a sketch of an idea.
It was just a sketch of an idea, but we also knew that we could have some latitude to really work with it, and it really came to life because we had so many images, and there were so many ideas that we just kind of I kept wanting to, to sort of fill the movie with as much of as possible, and the cube really allowed for that.
When you started collaborating with Ron, at least in the show, I'm curious if you had any fears. And the reason I ask this is that I'm preparing a couple of films, and I was talking with one of the potential subjects, and I said, are you concerned about anything? And this is a global figure who's appeared on Sesame Street, and he leans in, it was by Zoom, and he says, I'm worried that the film will be bad. So how do you address those questions? I mean, well,
oh no, it's going to be great.
It'll be the best film ever. We'll have a 40 share. Were there fears you had going into this? Were there uncertainties? I know you had a great deal of confidence in Ron, and for all sorts of good reasons. But you're human beings, and there are a lot of things at play here. It's in the film. There's the company, and there's a real sense of the company's legacy, and there's family and those things, and then as your family and Ron are acutely aware, there's an audience, and both you, Ron, and the Henson company and your mom and dad knew how to reach an audience, knew how to reach a big audience, and knew what that was like. So weighing all those things, I'm just curious, were you like,
I felt like we got over a lot of our fears when Brian J. Jones wrote a biography of my dad, and he was a really serious historian. And, just knowing that he was going to interview every single person, he was going to get two sides of every issue, and, it was going to be extensive. And I think at that time, we were a little more nervous, at least I was. Then the book came out, completely factual. People enjoyed it, but it didn't have the visuals. Like, how do you tell the Jim Henson story without these pictures? So yeah, for me, I got over it a bit with the biography and was just excited to see what would happen when it became cinematic.
How about you? Were you?
I just want to say that with Brian J. Jones's book, Karen Falk, our archivist, did a wonderful visual book to be the companion. And that just came back out with Ron's new introduction
It's
to
a
it.
great book, by the way. It's
Yeah.
very inspiring to us because it's kind of cinematic, even in a way.
Yep, and it does illustrate the biography. So I think the whole thing that my mom really wanted to get my dad's story out there, and that she actually set up a separate nonprofit called the Jim Henson Legacy, specifically to get exhibits up, to get film festivals up of dad's work, that even though they were separated, that it was so important to her to celebrate him as an artist. And she was concerned that what is the future of the company? What direction is it going to take? Will it stay in family hands? Will it go off to some other company entirely? And she really wanted to preserve what was Dad's work and where he had his own hand in making it. And so I think knowing that that's what she really wanted and to get that story out, people didn't talk about them being separated that much, and whether or not they were actually divorced at the end is still a little bit in question. but they were, but were they? It's not a story we talked about. We did not talk about our parents being separated. So I think that was a bit of a concern, because while she was still alive, everyone was very respectful of her sense of still being Jim Henson's wife, even though he was actively dating other people. That's the culture that she came from. So I think that she had passed away, that she wanted something like this told, she wanted the story to be told. I think that's probably the biggest concern is, wow, we actually have not told this story before. And now we're ready to tell the story, and that's okay.
Jane was something new. Jane was someone that interested you from the get-go, and you talked about the audio tapes and that sort of thing. Is there something central about her that you discovered, or that you came away from the finished film?
Oh, well, very well. Just how creative she was, and what great taste she had, which I know informed so much of what was going on. And while she didn't necessarily have that sort of performer's personality, or that that what she did have was a great understanding of what was good. And which is again what Frank brought, and other key people, and it was just I thought their relationship was interesting, and that they were sort of connected over the art, and then they kind of recognized that they had so much in common, and even she's saying, well, it's kind of hard to talk about love and romance. I don't know, but we were just together all the time. Well, to me, that's kind of unusual and interesting. And to me, it indicates that there are many paths to take toward, sort of actualization. And theirs was unique. But I just wanted to make sure that people kind of understood that Jim wasn't an island. And long before Frank and others that we kind of know about, Jane was so central and elemental to making this thing come to life.
you talked about the book and then the picture companion book, but neither of them have songs in them.
Or
And-
performance, more than anything else, the
Performance.
comedy in the performance.
Yeah, and I was struck sitting here watching the film with an audience. There's a moment right about, pretty close to the middle of the film, where Rita Moreno enters the story. She has this wonderful little acknowledgement of how tough I think Jim could be, where he says to her, "Rita, this is London. There's no overtime." And your brother has a moment like that where he's talking about, this is gonna be the best film ever, and he says, "Well, you better." It's like, oh, okay. He could get things done. But that's immediately followed by Kermit singing about being green. And there was something about the emotional contrast between those moments and what her perspective on that song brings that just made, this is sort of the core of this God. And I mean, there are so many sides as the cube and all those anecdotes at the end articulate, but there's something really just central about that song and how it makes you feel.
Yeah, well,
Did
he was always, reaching for that. I mean, I think that was just elemental to him, was connection, and also imperfection. I mean, that none of us are entirely confident, or if we are, it's a little silly that we're so confident, like Miss Piggy, or something. Let's make fun of that. And,
Yes.
I think he was always looking for that. But the beauty is that he was just funny. He was just so entertaining, and he never wanted to be stuck on a soapbox. And yet he conveyed so much. And I think that's probably one of the big lessons of his work, if you're just looking for a headline.
Although when you talk about the songs, I recently did an NPR interview with Nick Raposa, who's Joe Raposa's son, and it was specifically around the song It's Not Easy Being Green. And one thing that I do miss my dad did not write the lyrics to It's Not Easy Being Green, and he didn't write the lyrics to the Paul Williams songs that are in the Muppet movie. And they express his ideas, but they are absolutely written by those composers. And I do kind of miss having a little more acknowledgement of some of the musical collaborators. But at the same time, I understand that it's very difficult to acknowledge every collaborator because there's so many collaborators on all the different productions.
I would say the music was the one area where, if I could wave a wand and if I thought the movie would hold for another 20 minutes, I think we would have focused more on it, because it is something that we just so appreciate and remember.
And he was a really good singer too. He loved to sing, and I have childhood memories of sitting with him in the car and him putting in the cassette and learning his songs while he was driving. And he was a very musical person. Some of the other puppeteers were not. And there was a lot of comedy amongst them about who can sing, who can't sing, a lot of teasing.
Better singers than Dad.
Some were better.
Definitely.
Yeah, it was a kind of the musical part was quite competitive, quite fun, and I'm completely tone deaf. I don't know. That just missed me entirely. But it was really fun to watch those guys sing together, and the ones that can't sing, that was fun too, to watch them struggle. My dad would laugh so hard at them struggling. But you were talking before about these messages and the messages of those lyrics, and of course our dad was just not self-important at all, and so I think he was much more likely to want to puncture somebody for being bloated, or hated the sound of being bloated himself. He just didn't want to be self-important.
Well, that was part of the secret, and that was why when Rita said, "Come on, we know that's it's inexplicit but completely clear, and it's clear through the emotion that it creates rather than through a soapbox."
But I also like that he was enough of a businessman to build, a company, and he exhausted himself with it, but he recognized those opportunities. A great friend of mine and kind of a mentor is George Lucas, and they were very close. My feelings about Jim were very influenced by the way George felt about him. And when Jim died, George was just shattered by that. But I saw there's some similarities in that, guys who just very simply could be wildly creative, weren't necessarily driven by money or the pursuit of it, but recognized its value in leverage and life, and understood how to kind of cut out the middleman and just take on that load and responsibility and be businesslike about things. And so I wanted to sort of acknowledge that in the film as well, because nobody is just one thing. And part of the reason that we know so much about him and is that he was conscientious, and he did build something really lasting.
And there is that shrine to the dollar.
Yeah, exactly.
But he thought being driven by money was foolish, and that's what the altar thing is about. It's like, well, we have to make money, but it's also foolish to be driven just by making money.
And your mom felt that way too.
Very much.
Great moment where she says, "No, you've got to take that risk." It's a great moment in the movie. I mean, in their life, I think it just again says a lot. Even at a moment when she was probably thinking about the future and how the relationship, what it was going to mean to the kids and mean to her, and she was willing to say, "No, you've got to bet on your talent. You've got to invest in it."
Absolutely. I also feel like controlling his business was about creative control also, and not wanting to have something pulled away from him. I think the whole thing of having Dark Crystal almost finished, and then the possibility that it would never open, that the new buyers would just put it in a can and it would be vaulted, it would be gone. And he had put so much into that film. So I think a lot of it was not just about the business, but about creative control.
And there's also the theme of partnership, which I know is central to your creative life.
Yeah.
You've had a long-time partner. I was so touched by Frank Oz, especially, in the way he spoke about that relationship and about how he evolved as a person.
Well, of course, I knew they were close, and Frank's made a couple of films at Imagine, and I've known him over the years, but never really had a conversation with him about Jim, and so I knew the interview was going to be critical, but it was sort of defining very early on. I mean, he is such a good storyteller himself, but also and just a great communicator, and I find that, and I'm sure you do too. Every once in a while, there's that interview that suddenly starts to tell you what else the film could be, what other ideas you are rich and really worth sharing. And Frank blew us away on that day, and we learned so much about Jim just by his body language and in addition to the specifics of what he was saying.
Yeah, you mentioned the body language. That is, I mean, a huge part of the power of a documentary interview is the nonverbal. It's what you're seeing and sensing. Speaking of seeing and sensing, we have an audience full of questions, I'm sure. So I want to pivot at this moment to you all. There are microphones on either side. If you've got questions for any of our guests, this is the moment.